Okay, so in this lecture, we will be talking about the lymphatic system, the different organs involved, the function of the lymphatic system, especially its immune system function. So we have different components of the immune system. So first up, we have the lymph, and the lymph is formed after your interstitial fluid passes into the lymphatic vessels. Lymphatic vessels are these ones here, the blood vessel looking things. That interstitial fluid is formed when your blood plasma or your blood is filtered through the blood capillary walls. Remember when we talked about capillaries, they're the ones where exchange happens because the walls are very, very thin. So the wastes go out so that the blood is filtered there through the capillaries and the waste goes back into the lymph system. Okay. So lymphatic vessels, basically, they're the ones that transport the lymph, while lymphatic tissues are specialized forms of reticular connective tissue that contains a large number of these lymphocytes, or the main cells of the lymphatic system. They are agranular white blood cells, and we have two types of lymphocytes. We have B and T lymphocytes, and we'll talk about those later. The lymphatic system has different functions. First off, it drains excess interstitial fluid. So your lymph vessels drain that excess fluid from tissue spaces and then return it to blood. Remember, in those blood capillaries, that's where this excess drain exchange happens. It also transports dietary lipids. So the lymph vessels, other than just being sort of the basurero of the body, they also transport lipids as well as lipid-soluble vitamins. Your lipid-soluble vitamins are ADEK, A, D, E, and K. So lipid-soluble vitamins, again, are vitamins A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K, ADEK. And these vitamins are taken from the gastrointestinal system, so by the GIT, from the GIT. Okay, so from there, those vitamins pass through the lymph system because they can't go through the blood since the blood is mostly made up of water. So those lipid-soluble vitamins go through the lymph vessels. Lastly, and one of the most important functions of the lymph system is actually they carry out immune responses, meaning they initiate highly specific responses directed against particular microbes or abnormal cells in the human body. Okay? So first let's talk about these lymph vessels. Okay. These lymphatic vessels have thinner walls and more valves than small veins. So remember when we talked about the blood vessels, the veins have these valves to help them be pushed through the vessels. But in comparison to our small veins, these lymphatic vessels have more valves. But because they function for filtration, they gather all these wastes from the blood, they have thinner walls to allow for easier exchange. At several intervals along the lymph vessels, the lymph flows through lymph nodes. Okay, and we'll talk about those lymph nodes more thoroughly later. So just like how we have your blood capillaries, we have the lymphatic capillaries, and they are located between those cells and closed on one end. So they're located between cells, like you see here, different cells here, and they're located there in between them. And they're closed on one end, meaning they have a blunt end, this one. They're very closed. These lymphatic vessels unite to form larger lymphatic vessels, and they can absorb large molecules such as proteins and lipids. Okay. They have a greater permeability than your blood capillaries because, again, one of its functions is to drain excess interstitial fluid. So it will have an easier time to exchange if it has greater permeability, or it's easier for things to pass through it. That's what permeability means. The diameter of these capillaries are also slightly larger than your blood capillaries, and they are a one-way structure. So what does that mean? It means that it allows for fluid to come into the vessels, but fluid cannot come out of these lymphatic vessels, unlike the blood capillaries. Okay, again, lymphatic capillaries do not allow the lymph to escape from the capillaries or the vessels after they have come in. Okay, they cannot go out anymore. So here, look at this one, the one highlighted in red, these ones. These are called your lacteals, and lacteals are just specialized lymphatic capillaries that you find in your gastrointestinal system. Specifically, you find them within the villi of the small intestine. These lacteals are the ones that carry out the function of transporting dietary lipids. So the lacteals will carry those lipids into the lymph vessels and then to the blood. Okay? So, ano ulit yung vitamins that are lipid soluble? Remember, ADEC. A, D, E, and K. Okay? Other than your lacteals, we have another term called chyle, okay? Chyle. And chyle is creamy white lymph, which is rich in lipids and they're drained from the small intestine. So anywhere else in the body, it's just lymph. But when it is lipid rich, because you got it from the lacteals of the small intestine, okay, if the lymph is from the lacteals and they gather the dietary lipids from your gastrointestinal system, that is chyle. Okay, and chyle is creamy white. Now let's talk about our lymphatic organs, the specific ones. The lymph system and its organs are divided into two. We have the primary and the secondary structures. The primary structures are is where the proliferation and maturation of lymphocytes, the main cells of the lymph system, happen, while the secondary structures is where they become specialized, they proliferate in such a way that they once they're specialized, they create more. Okay, this is where they respond whenever they have to respond. Okay, again, they are produced and they mature in the primary structures while they become specialized and they become activated in the secondary structures. Okay, so primary structures muna tayo. In the primary structures, we have two, the bone marrow and the thymus. So the first of them, we have the bone marrow, and it is a jelly-like substance within the bone. Okay? This is where synthesis of all the blood cell types happens, and it is also the site of B cell maturation. Okay? So please note that in the bone marrow, the B and the T cells grow from there. Okay, they're produced there. However, B cells are called B cells because they mature in the bone marrow. But the T cells, they do not mature here. Okay, we have two different types of bone marrow. We have red and yellow. The red bone marrow is red because it's made up of clusters of hematopoietic islands, meaning it's made of hematopoietic stem cells. Remember what I said about stem cells? Stem cells, you can create other cells from it, okay? And hematopoietic stem cells are multipotent, meaning they can become any of the blood cells, okay? While the yellow bone marrow naman, it is yellow because it's already infiltrated or just made up of a lot of adipocytes or your fat cells, as well as dormant or no longer functioning hematopoietic clusters. Okay, so the ones that are yummy that you eat inside yung sa bulalo or when you have roasted bone marrow, that's actually the yellow bone marrow. It's just full of fat. Okay, the red bone marrow is not very yummy kasi it's made up of more of these hematopoietic stem cells. This picture shows us that the hematopoietic stem cells eventually can become any blood cell, as you see here. You have the lymphoid cells, B and T cells, or they can become myeloid cells. Included there in the myeloid line are your RBCs, monocytes, neutrophils, etc. Okay? In babies, almost all of the bones would have red bone marrow, but in adults, as you grow up, it will involute and they will become yellow bone marrow. That's why in adults, or in you and in me, we will only find the red bone marrow in the flat bones. Ano yung mga flat bones? Like the skull, 'di ba? The skull is a flat bone. The pelvis as well, and the proximal ends of the long bones have red bone marrow. Okay? That's where you'll find it na lang, not everywhere. The other primary structure of or organ of the lymphatic system is the thymus. And the thymus is a bilobed organ in the mediastinum. 'Di ba kilala niyo na siya from the endocrine system because it releases thymosin, which I already mentioned helps in the maturation of T cells. So dito pala nagmamature si T cells. The T cells get produced or they're produced from the bone marrow, but the maturation happens here in the thymus, kaya T cell. Okay? And you already know they're located behind the sternum and it's in front of the aorta. Since ngayon, alam niyo na 'di ba saan si aorta? The thymus has several parts, and the first part we call the cortex, and the cortex is the outer portion of the thymus. It's composed of T cells, dendritic cells, epithelial cells, and macrophages. Those T cells, as you already know, they are lymphocytes. Pero dito sa thymus, they start out immature first, and they migrate from the red bone marrow to the cortex dito, where they proliferate and they begin to mature. Okay, and we'll talk a little about how they mature here. The dendritic cells are derived from monocytes from the myeloid cell line. Epithelial cells are also there. So, ano ba itong epithelial cells na to? These epithelial cells of the thymus are there for positive selection. And positive selection is basically educating the immature T cells. Okay, what is that? How do they do that? These epithelial cells will present the immature T cells with mga foreign na signals, okay? Or antigens, foreign na mga signals or antigens. If the immature T cells get to recognize those foreign harmful substances, they live on. They will proliferate. But if they can't and they fail to do that, those immature T cells will stop growing and they will apoptose and die. Okay, so isipin ninyo, the thymus is like the police academy for the T cells. Okay. The immature T cells are like the new recruits. They just came in. And the positive selection, that is basically like a test for them. This is one of their tests. And if they pass the test, kasi ang ginagawa sa test na to, they get presented with, kunwari, evidence. They get presented with possible na mga criminals sa test na to. If they get to identify who the criminal is, then they will basically pass the test and they can go on to the next stage of their maturation or they can graduate from their first year in the police academy. Okay, parang ganon. The macrophages naman help clear out debris of dead and dying cells. So if they don't pass the first test of the police academy, those immature T cells will be cleared out and the macrophages help clear out those dead na hindi pumasa na immature T cells. Okay. Once the T cells pass the first part, they pass positive selection, they will pass on to the medulla. And in the medulla, you will find very widely scattered, more mature T cells. So kung first year pa lang sila sa cortex, pumasa sila sa positive selection test, they can now go on to the next stage of their maturation in the medulla. Sa medulla, syempre hindi pa sila graduate. They're still in the police academy. They're still in the thymus. So, they are tested again by negative selection. And negative selection is quite the opposite of positive. Because in negative selection, so alam na natin na these T cells at this point in the medulla, they know how to recognize sino yung harmful. But we have to make sure also that these T cells will not attack our own body cells. They will not attack civilians. They will not attack non-criminals. So, they will be presented with self-antigens, so yung mga sa iyo lang, sa body mo. If they recognize na hindi yon dapat i-attack, okay, if they don't think na these are uh, antigens from foreign substances, they will proliferate. Okay? Magmamature na sila. But if they attack these self-antigens, if they attack these signals for our own blood cells, of our own cells, they will die. Okay? They get cleared out, they apoptose, and they die. Pag napasa nila si negative selection, therefore, we know that these cells can, one, detect the bad or the harmful na cells, and two, they will not attack our own cells. Okay? Pumasa sila sa positive and negative selection, and when they get out of the thymus, they are now mature T cells. They can now detect basically the criminals in the body. Okay? Graduate na sila. They are now fully fledged T cells. A very good indicator that we are in the medulla of the thymus is that we'll find these structures called Hassel's corpuscles, okay, or thymic corpuscles. And these are epithelial cells that eventually become arranged into concentric layers of flat cells that degenerate and become keratohyalin granules and keratin. So, ano ba itsura niyan? Okay, you see these ones here? Okay. Other slides, they will also look like bundle, like parang roses, okay? And those are your Hassel's corpuscles, okay? Now, T cells that leave the thymus via the blood migrate to lymph nodes, spleen, and other lymphatic tissues. So, review lang. Here, we have the cortex, okay? Your thymus is an encapsulated organ, so may capsule siya. Right underneath the capsule, you have your cortex, and then in the middle, you have the medulla, and the medulla is lighter in color. Okay? Extensions of the capsule into these areas, you see this, that's called your trabecula, okay, or interlobular septa, and they will separate the different lobes of the thymus. Okay, so capsule goes in there, trabecula. Okay, now let's look at the secondary organs of the lymph system. Okay? We have the lymph nodes very first, and lymph nodes are encapsulated just like our thymus. Okay, they're also encapsulated, and the capsule is still made of dense, irregular connective tissue. They are also bean-shaped like this. Okay, mukha silang mga monggo. Right? Yeah, they look like mongo. And they're scattered throughout the body. They are basically just masses of the mature B and T cells that are ready to respond. Diba? They've already graduated from the thymus and the bone marrow, so they are ready. Isipin nyo, the lymph nodes are kind of like the different precincts or different police stations na may nakastation na doon na mga new recruits into the police force. These lymph nodes will enlarge when the body is exposed to harmful organisms or substances. Basically, if they see any foreign substance, like just like how if there's a criminal on the loose, there will be units that are trained and dispatched from the police station, okay, from the office ng, so from the police station basically. There are two main components of the lymph nodes. We have the parenchyma and the stroma. The parenchyma is basically the functional part, so that's made up of your lymphocytes, your B and T cells, while the stroma is just the environment in which the lymphocytes exist. So that is the supportive framework made up of reticular connective tissue. We also have different parts or layers of the lymph node just like the thymus, but the cortex of the lymph nodes is divided into two. We have the outer cortex where we will see egg-shaped aggregates of B cells. Okay, you see this one? Yan, mga egg-shaped. Outer cortex. It consists of primary lymph follicles or lymph nodules as well as secondary lymph nodules. The primary lymph nodules are the ones that look like just aggregates na darker. But this one here, if you see it, my dark na ring, and there's a lighter area in the middle, this is now a secondary lymph nodule. And this only happens, okay, so from a primary, it will become secondary in response to antigen stimulation. So if there is some evidence that there's a criminal on the loose, that's the evidence. Antigen is like the evidence. The primary lymph nodules will be alerted and they become a secondary lymph nodule where your plasma cells and B cells will form. Okay, they will proliferate there. Very telling of the secondary lymph nodule, you'll find this lighter area in the middle called the germinal center because that is where the B cells will become plasma cells. Okay, nandyan yung mga maturation and activation, proliferation nila. Yan. The germinal centers will have your B cells as well as memory B cells. Memory B cells are those that remember the antigen or the evidence for future use. So in case babalik na naman yung same na criminal, meron silang palatandaan na, oh right, this is a criminal, we have to attack it right away. So the next time that you get infected by something with the same antigen, the memory B cells will remind your immune system that, hey, we have to fight this. So, faster na yung response. We also have follicular dendritic cells which present the antigens to the lymphocytes and macrophages that again will help clear out the debris. Going inward, we have the inner cortex, also called the paracortex. And here, you will not find anymore those lymph nodules like this one here. Okay, wala na yon. It is mainly composed of T cells and dendritic cells. So, dito na lang siya. Okay, again, no lymph nodules, no circle thingies. Lastly, we have the medulla, and the medulla contains B cells for the most part. Okay, and as well as plasma cells. So, what are these plasma cells? These plasma cells are antibody producing cells, and antibodies are the ones that detect the antigen. So, para silang antenna. Okay, we'll see them later. We'll talk about these antibodies in more detail later. Another secondary lymph organ is your spleen. And the spleen is actually the largest single mass of lymphatic tissue in the body. And if you notice, it looks like a very, very big lymph node. Okay, because that's essentially kind of what it is. Okay, a very gigantic lymph tissue bulk. It's located in the hypochondriac region between the stomach and the diaphragm in the upper left quadrant of the abdomen. Okay? It's also encapsulated just like the thymus and the lymph node. And the capsule still made of dense, irregular connective tissue. In comparison, however, to the lymph node, wala na siyang yung mga follicle masyado. Okay? Wala na siyang cortex, wala na siyang medulla. Instead, it has a white pulp and a red pulp. The white pulp is lymphatic tissue. It's mostly made of lymphocytes and macrophages around branches of the splenic artery called the central artery. Okay? So these areas here are the white pulp. Okay? Yung may mga very malaki na darkly stained nucleus because that's what your lymphocytes look like. Very darkly stained big nuclei. That's your white pulp. Okay? While the red pulp, these here you see, the red pulp is blood filled, na venous sinuses as well as splenic cords of Billroth. And the function of the red pulp is to remove worn out defective cells and platelets. It also stores platelets, roughly 1/3 of the total in our body, and they produce RBCs during the fetal age. If you know from other readings or from before pa, the spleen is also called the graveyard of your red blood cells, specifically because of this. They remove worn out or defective cells and platelets. So this is where your red blood cells go to die, and they are in the red pulp. That's why the red pulp is red because it's blood filled. Okay? Another Secondary organ is the lymphatic nodules. And the lymphatic nodules, unlike the ones we discussed na before, they are not encapsulated. They are diffusely located within the mucosa or the lamina propria of our mucous membranes. Okay. So mucous membranes like in your mouth, okay, along the vaginal wall, etc. Okay, those are our mucosa, and even inside your gut, inside your small intestine, stomach, etc. Okay? The lymphatic nodules that you find here are called mucosa associated lymphatic tissue or MALT because of that, because they are in the mucosa, and they will contain egg-shaped masses of lymphatic tissue, yung parang secondary follicles. Okay? They're scattered through the lamina propria, again, of mucous membranes. Kaya MALT tawag sa kanila. An example of them, you'll find them in the oral cavity, are your tonsils. Your tonsils are part of the lymphatic system. That's why if they get inflamed, if you've ever had tonsillitis, di ba lumalaki sila? Just like how your lymph nodes will be enlarging when you have an infection. Okay, that's why di ba kinakapa ng doctors yung sa may neck ninyo or near your armpit kasi marami diyang lymph nodes. And if they are swollen, just like if your tonsil is swollen, you might have some sort of infection. Okay? This one naman on the right side is a cross-section of the appendix. And you see there yung mga secondary follicle-looking things. Ayan, mga secondary follicles around the appendix because in the lamina propria. Now, let's talk about a very important function of the lymphatic system, which is for immunity. Okay? So, the lymphatic system, other than clearing out the waste from the blood, ito yung very big function niya in the body. And it's divided into two. We have the innate immunity as well as adaptive immunity. Okay? We'll go through them one by one. The innate immunity is basically non-specific. It is the first line of defense, okay? Your body doesn't need to look for evidences, okay? Diretso na silang mag-attack, okay? They're just there to protect you. The first line of defense are mostly your skin and mucous membranes, okay? Like your epidermis of the skin, mucous membranes, the mucus, your hair, cilia, saliva, okay? Ano nga yung mga um, defense mechanisms in our skin? Okay? Remember nyo yun sila, ha? Like your defensin, do you remember that? Okay, we also have saliva, your urine, sebum, lysozyme, etc. that you find in your, di ba nasa tears din siya. Okay, so basically, they don't need evidence. They're just there to protect you right away. The second line naman of defense are the internal defenses. They're still innate because they do not need any evidence, any antigens to, well, they do, but they don't need um any more processing for an attack to happen. Okay, they just know immediately na the body cannot be exposed to this, so we will fight it right away. Okay, like your interferons, okay, they protect us from viral infection. We have the complement system, which helps promote phagocytosis and contributes to inflammation, while inflammation confines and destroys microbes non-specifically. Okay, the body will just know na this is a criminal, pero hindi nila alam kung ano yung crime that criminal committed. Okay, think about it that way. They know it's a criminal, but they do not know what crime that criminal committed. Okay, so ayan, these are the ones. Please take note of this table. You'll also find this in Marieb. Okay, and memorize it as much as you can, because this is very useful even in your higher years. Okay, so from the non-specific immunity, where again the body doesn't need to know the specifics of what happens. Okay? We also have the adaptive immunity. And the adaptive immunity is a specialized immunity because it has to recognize first what the invading organism or what the harmful organism is. So what happens? From the red bone marrow, diba, that's where we will create our lymphocytes. The lymphocytes destined to become T cells will migrate to the thymus and develop immunocompetence. Remember, they will undergo positive and negative selection there, as well as the B cells develop immunocompetence in the red bone marrow. The immunocompetent cells, meaning yung mga graduate na from police academy, are still naive when they come out of the bone marrow and the thymus. Okay, the B cells and T cells that come out, they know how to catch a criminal, but they have never seen a criminal before, which makes them naive lymphocytes. Okay, they leave those academies and they seed or go to the lymph nodes, the spleen, and other lymphoid tissues. Once they encounter the antigen or any evidence that there's a criminal, they become activated. Okay? And these antigen activated or mature immunocompetent lymphocytes circulate continuously in the bloodstream and the lymph throughout the lymphoid organs of the body, and they start to do their work. Okay? Again, they grow up from the red bone marrow, they mature in the thymus or the bone marrow. Once they've graduated from either, so bone marrow for B cells, thymus for T cells, they will now go to the different precincts or the different police stations. And once they see evidence or antigen of any criminal, they will now be activated and go through the body to look for these criminals and deal with them as needed. Okay, it really depends on what type of cell they are, if they are cytotoxic T cells, etc. Okay, you don't need to know the specifics for now. But if you want to learn about them, you surely can read about them. Okay, now how are these B cells selected for? Okay, so we talked about how the T cells mature. So, paano ba yung pag inactivate natin si B cells? Okay. The initial meeting with the antigen will stimulate the primary response in which your B cell will divide rapidly. Okay. They divide rapidly to form clones of their own cells. Okay. Forming a clone of the cells that look like them. That's called clonal selection, most of which become antibody producing cells called plasma cells. Okay, these ones. Most of them become these cells, plasma cells. And the cells that do not differentiate into these cells become memory B cells. Remember, I told you the memory B cells are the ones that remember the type of antigen that was detected. Para the next time, it's going to be a faster response if they ever see that antigen again. Should such a meeting occur, those memory cells will quickly produce more memory cells and larger numbers of effector plasma cells with the same antigen. So responses generated by these memory cells are now called a secondary response. Okay, so initial meeting, dito muna, magiging plasma cells yung most to produce antibodies, and some of them will become a memory B cell, and the memory B cell is like reserved for the next time where you might meet the antigen. Okay? That's clonal selection. You're choosing the ones that become activated with the antigen. Okay? Now let's talk about the immunoglobulins. Okay? Your immunoglobulins is formed, or the antibody is formed by 4 polypeptide chains. So this is a protein kasi polypeptide. Okay? That antibody has 2 light chains. This one, the one colored in a more blue-green-ish color. Okay. While you have these 2 other ones, these are your heavy chains. Okay, yung medyo um, with a more violet hue. Those are your heavy chains. These 2 chains, the heavy and the light chains, are connected together by a disulfide bond, this one. And the 2 heavy chains are also connected by a disulfide bond. Okay. Each chain has a variable region, the V areas here, and these V areas are antigen binding sites. So sila yung magde-detect ng antigens. They are the ones that will detect the evidence for whatever crime was committed. Okay, I hope you're following the analogy with crime and the police. This will differ in different antibodies. Okay, mag-iiba-iba tong variable portion. That's why it's variable, so that they're specific for whatever antigen they need to look for. While the C regions are the constant regions, and they're essentially identical in different antibodies of the same class. Okay, so what are those classes of antibodies? The plasma cells can produce different types of antibodies, and we have five major classes of them. We have IgD, M, G, A, and E. Okay? Your IgD, you virtually find them always attached to the B cell. Okay, they're not usually freely roaming, and they're believed to be the cell surface receptor for the B cells. And they're very important in the activation of that B cell kasi nga almost always attached siya to the B cell. Your IgM is another one that is attached to the B cell, but they can also be found free in the plasma. Okay, when it's bound to your B cell membrane, it is a receptor similar to the IgD, and this is the very first class of immunoglobulin released to the plasma during a primary response. Okay, so when I ask you what type of immunoglobulin is the first responder during a primary response, ang answer will be si IgM ang unang tataas. Okay? The next one is IgG, and of all of these ones, it is the smallest, and it is the most abundant antibody in the plasma, okay, or in the blood. They maintain or they are the main antibody of both primary and secondary responses. And because it's so small, it can cross the placenta and provide passive immunity to the fetus. Okay, so si IgG lang yung nakaka-pass through the placenta because it is very, very small. The IgA, on the other hand, it exists as a dimer, dalawa, or as a monomer. Okay, so si IgM pentamer kasi 5. So it can exist as a monomer or a dimer in secretions such as your saliva, tears, intestinal juices, and milk. It is basically the mucosal defense of the body from attachment of pathogen. So sila yung nandun sa may mucosa. They are the they are also the ones that are important for babies to get from breast milk. That's why we mga doctors, we always promote breastfeeding because otherwise you will not get this IgA from formula milk. Okay? Kailangan galing talaga yan kay mommy. Galing sa milk ni mommy. Okay? Breastfeeding always because your again, formula milk does not have this defense mechanism that you should give to the baby. And lastly, we have the IgE, and it's also a monomer. Okay, isa lang siya, mag-isa. It's secreted by the plasma cells in the skin, mucosa of gastrointestinal and respiratory tracts, as well as the tonsils. The IgE is very important in binding to mast cells and basophils that triggers the release of histamine, so mga allergic reactions, okay, and other chemicals that mediate inflammation. Okay? Kaya tayo, diba, we drink antihistamines to stop us from any allergic reaction. Kasi ito yon. This is the trigger for allergy, histamine. And IgE is an important player in the allergic response mechanism. We see here that the different types of IgEs, our immune system, have different functions. Okay. So these antibodies can be inactivated. So antibody plus antigen, they become antigen antibody complex. They can be they can inactivate the antigen by one, neutralization. Neutralization is basically blocking bacterial toxins and preventing the attachment of some viruses to body cells. Okay, that's what neutralization is. You neutralize the criminal. Agglutination, on the other hand, is when two or more sites of the antigen binding cross-link pathogens to one another. Okay, so ayan, they will hold them together. Um, in this way, your phagocytic cells, they ingest the agglutinated microbes more readily. We also have precipitation, so they will just precipitate out any soluble antigens para hindi na sila magsa-circulate throughout your body. Another is they can fix and activate. Okay, so what happens here? This antigen antibody complex can also activate the complementary system, which eventually will lead to cell lysis, or the lysing, the destruction of the infected cell, and can also enhance inflammation, just like how all these three will enhance phagocytosis and inflammation. Okay? This phagocytosis enhancement, the stem region or yung may constant na portion of the antibody, they basically act as a flag that attracts the phagocytes, like the macrophages. Once the antigen binds to the variable region, then the antibodies will coat the antigen to be more susceptible to phagocytosis. Basically, it's like the antibodies are tagging the antigens or the cells infected by the antigens so that they will become yummier to the phagocytes. Okay? This is the last slide. It shows here what happens once there is an immune response. Okay? So, why is it there? You have here the humoral immunity, which is the antibody mediated humoral or the adaptive immune response. And we also have a cellular or cell mediated adaptive immune response. So in this case, a cellular, this is mostly T cell, the humoral is mostly B cell. So on the first exposure with the antigen, some of the free antigens will directly activate the B cell, while some will be displayed by infected cells, and they will activate the cytotoxic T cells. The antigens may also be engulfed by our phagocytes like macrophages, and those macrophages become antigen presenting cells. Antigen presenting cells are basically the ones that will present the evidence for these criminals that are there. So, sila yung magrepresent na, uy, meron palang nag-infect sa body. Then, it will show the other cells. It will show it first to the helper T cell, and the helper T cells are helpers because they will stimulate the B and the T cells. There are also helper T cells that eventually become memory T cells, just like your memory B cells, so that they stimulate memory B cells and other memory T cells if meron nang nangyaring exposure before. Okay? Second exposure na. The B cells will give rise to the plasma cells and memory B cells, like we talked about in the clonal selection of B cells, while the cytotoxic T cells will become activated to defend against intracellular pathogens. Okay? B cells mostly for extracellular pathogens. Okay? Why is this here again? Sorry. And some of the cytotoxic T cells will also become memory cells to remind you of whatever will, um, to remind the immune system pag merong second exposure anytime later. Okay? So for the B cells, they work through the antibodies, so they defend against extracellular pathogens by binding to those antigens, the one we talked about, this slide here, the antibody antigen complexes, making them easier targets for phagocytes and the complement system. While the cytotoxic T cells, sila yung parang direct assassins, okay? Because they bind to and lyse the infected cells or cancer cells directly. They do not work by antibodies. They don't need to call phagocytes or the complement. Sila na mismo agad. Okay? They're very deadly. Kaya sila cytotoxic because they're very, very toxic to cells. Okay, so that is now the end of our lecture for the lymphatic system. I hope you read the book Okay, and memorize the tables that I told you to memorize. Again, this will be included in our quiz for next meeting. Have a good weekend.